My name is Miss Campbell, and today we are going to be talking about character development and as well character development in the Odyssey. So we're going to go over our objective for today before we begin our lesson. So the objective I want you guys to be thinking about as we go throughout the lesson and that I will be teaching for is we're going to analyze how complex characters develop over the course of a text to advance the plot and develop the theme. So be thinking about that as we go through our lesson. And to begin our lesson today, we're going to have a quick intro video about the Odyssey.
A close encounter with a man-eating giant. A sorceress who turns men into pigs. A long-lost king taking back his throne. On their own, any of these make great stories. But each is just one episode in the Odyssey, a 12,000-line poem spanning years of ancient Greek history, myth, and legend. How do we make sense of such a massive text that comes from and tells of a world so far away? The fact that we can read the Odyssey at all is pretty incredible, as it was composed before the Greek alphabet appeared in the 8th century BCE. It was made for listeners rather than readers, and was performed by oral poets called rhapsodes. Tradition identifies its author as a blind man named Homer, but no one definitively knows whether he was real or legendary. The earliest mentions of him occur centuries after his era, and the poems attributed to him seem to have been changed and rearranged many times by multiple authors before finally being written down in their current form. In fact, the word rhapsode means stitching together, as these poets combined existing stories, jokes, myths, and songs into a single narrative. To recite these massive epics live, rhapsodes employed a steady meter, along with mnemonic devices like repetition of memorized passages or set pieces. These included descriptions of scenery and lists of characters, and helped the rhapsode keep their place in the narrative, just as the chorus or bridge of a song helps us to remember the next verses. Because most of the tales were familiar to the audience, it was common to hear the sections of the poem out of order. At some point, the order became set in stone, and the story was locked into place as the one we read today. But since the world has changed a bit in the last several thousand years, it helps to have some background before jumping in. The Odyssey itself is a sequel to Homer's other famous epic, the Iliad, which tells the story of the Trojan War. If there's one major theme uniting both poems, it's this: do not, under any circumstances, incur the wrath of the gods. The Greek pantheon is a dangerous mix of divine power and human insecurity, prone to jealousy and grudges of epic proportions. And many of the problems faced by humans in the poems are caused by their hubris, or excessive pride in believing themselves superior to the gods. The desire to please the gods was so great that the ancient Greeks traditionally welcomed all strangers into their homes with generosity, for fear that the strangers might be gods in disguise. This ancient code of hospitality was called xenia. It involved hosts providing their guests with safety, food, and comfort, and the guests returning the favor with courtesy and gifts if they had them. Xenia has a significant role in the Odyssey, where Odysseus in his wanderings is the perpetual guest, while in his absence, his clever wife Penelope plays non-stop host. The Odyssey recounts all of Odysseus's years of travel, but the narrative begins in medias res, in the middle of things. 10 years after the Trojan War, we find our hero trapped on an island, still far from his native Ithaca and the family he hasn't seen for 20 years. Because he's angered the sea god Poseidon by blinding his son, a Cyclops, Odysseus's passage home has been fraught with mishap after mishap. With trouble brewing at home and gods discussing his fate, Odysseus begins the account of those missing years to his hosts. One of the most fascinating things about the Odyssey is the gap between how little we know about its time period and the wealth of detail the text itself contains. Historians, linguists, and archaeologists have spent centuries searching for the ruins of Troy and identifying which islands Odysseus visited. Just like its hero, The 24-book epic has made its own long journey through centuries of myth and history to tell us its incredible story today.
All right, well, that was just a brief look at the Odyssey and kind of what we are going to be discussing today. So the video discussed a lot about the Odyssey's history and the time, as well as the book itself. So the history of literature is very important, just to know the background. That way we know how the author wrote it and what was going on at the time as well. So yes, that video was a wonderful piece from TED Ed. So we will use those videos a lot in our classroom. So here's a little bit more of the history of the times. So we think the Odyssey was written by Homer, although the video did a good job of pointing out that we're not sure who actually wrote it, or if Homer was actually a real person. So that's just the best guess that we have. And then it was written around the 8th century BC in Greece, and it was possible that it was told by mouth before it was written down, so it was more of an oral story, which is again what they talked about in the video. But the first printed version was produced in 1488, and it was organized by scholars in Alexandria into 24 books. So the version that we read today is the version that they produced in Alexandria. So other important world events that were happening at the time: the classical Mayan Empire is on the decline, the Caliphate campaigns are at full force in India, and Charlemagne invades present-day northwest Germany and incorporates Saxony into the Christian world. So those are some other key history events that are happening around this time. Greek culture at the time: Greece is emerging out of the Dark Ages. They are now in the Archaic period. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet but modified it to make it a new Greek alphabet. And a great deal of current Western literature comes from the Iliad and the Odyssey. So these pieces are very relevant to the history and the literature that we have today. So it's important that we study it. And let's get on with our lesson.
Okay, so you guys should have read book 9 last night as part of your homework. So we're just going to go over part of it to make sure that everybody got the same key points. So in the video it talked about hubris, that is excessive pride, which Odysseus obviously has, and that comes into play in book 9. Polyphemus is the Cyclops, and that's actually Poseidon's son. So Odysseus and his men are stranded on this island, and they come across Polyphemus and are brought into Polyphemus's cave, and then the Cyclops ends up eating some of Odysseus's men. And so to keep from him eating Odysseus and other men that are left, Odysseus decides to stab Polyphemus in the eye and blind him. When Polyphemus is asking who he is, Odysseus says nobody. So when Polyphemus is yelling out for help to the other Cyclops, he says nobody is hurting me. And so the other Cyclopses don't come. And that's fine and a good idea until Odysseus decides he has too much pride and tells Polyphemus that his name is Odysseus and that's the guy who hurt him. And so then the Cyclops knows who he is and is able to tell other people and just gets real angry. And so to escape, Odysseus and his men decide to hide underneath Polyphemus's sheep. And as the sheep run out of the cave, they are able to escape. And since the gods know everything, Poseidon gets mad for Odysseus blinding his son, and so he ends up throwing the ocean off course, and Odysseus is continuing to not be able to get home. And this is just a picture of Polyphemus, getting wrath on the men. So that would be Polyphemus, and that's Odysseus and his men trying to leave. All right, so now we're going to work on character development for this book specifically. So on the board, I have this chart basically recreated in simpler terms. All right, so in the beginning, what are some traits of Odysseus at the beginning of this book?
He's very hubris.
What else?
with his traits being hubris, he also thinks that he can defy the gods and make it home on his own.
Good. And in the middle, does he like lose some hubris? Think he's like too smart for them?
In the middle, he's right after he stops the Cyclops, and when he yells, "I am nobody," he's still thinking that, wow, I have all this hubris. I just defeated the son of Poseidon.
Good. And then in the end, does he learn his lesson, or is he just
In the end,
continuing?
In the end, he does not continue because he realizes that Poseidon has delayed him getting home. So he is angered as well as he is defeated by his wit and hubris.
Good. And then how does this affect the overall theme of the story?
How does this affect the overall theme?
Yes, or does it help like the flow of the story?
It shows that once you get to the climax of the story, it shows that you're wanting to, as he was climbing up with his hubris, he reaches the climax when defeating Poseidon's son. And then on the downfall, he's realizing his mistakes before he gets to the bottom, and that's carrying the story on to tell you about how he realized his mistakes.
Okay, so he continued making the same mistakes and then is in the process of learning that
Yes.
these are mistakes. Good. Alright, so now I'm going to break you guys into groups, and I'm going to pull up on the board a group number and then what book you're assigned. So for that book, you need to read it and then fill out the charts that I shared with you in Google Classroom, which is the same one that I had on the slideshow, and fill that out for Odysseus in your specific book at that moment. So here are the assignments.
Okay, class, let's turn our attention to the board for the end of our lesson today. So on this PowerPoint, and it's linked also in my syllabus not our syllabus, in the lesson plan for today, so if you guys will look at that on Google Classroom, you can look at some additional reading and information. So if anybody wants any extra credit for next time, you can read one of these articles. Well, the first one's actually a link to the full story, so you can read one of these 2 articles, and you can write a 3-paragraph summary and bring that to class, or turn it into class Google Classroom by the next time. But these are some great readings about the history behind the Odyssey, as well as why does the Odyssey matter today. So those are some good additional readings if anybody would like any extra credit. And then I'm going to encourage you guys to turn in your group projects on Google Classroom before you leave, so turn in those worksheets that you've been working on. You should have had plenty of time to get those done in class. And then the next time you come to class, you should also have your paper turned in as well. So great job paying attention today, everyone, and we will see you next time.